I want to ask you something. What time did your weekend end last week? Not when Sunday became Monday morning. I mean, when did it actually end for you? For a lot of us, and a lot of people I'm talking to these days, it's Sunday afternoon around 4 or 5 o'clock, either before or after dinner. The light changes, something shifts inside your chest. And even though you haven't opened a single email or even located where you left your laptop on Friday afternoon, if you're lucky, Saturday, if you're not so lucky, the week has already started. I know that feeling. I've sat on a couch on a Sunday doing nothing wrong, watching something, resting, reading a book, hanging out with my husband or chatting with my son, and still felt it, that low hum of dread creeping in before I'd done anything to deserve it. I used to call it being responsible. I used to call it taking my work seriously. It took me a long time to call it what it actually was, which was burnout, which many of us are calling it out these days. It doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it just looks like a Sunday afternoon that doesn't feel like yours anymore before you're quite ready to give it up. The wrong assumption, where I get it wrong and where I've gotten it wrong for a long time. I thought burnout was a late career, mid career at the earliest, maybe even a bit of a midlife problem. In my work today, where I have a lot less burnout because I've made some choices in recent years, as I coach executives and conduct leadership advising, most of the burnout that I see today shows up in people later in their careers. So, senior leaders in their late 40s, 50s, early 60s, executives that are carrying decades of pressure. So, in my head, burnout had to show up as sort of a rite to passage. It was something you grew into, something that showed up later in life. I've got to admit, I had it way wrong. I thought burnout was a late, maybe a little bit closer to mid to late career, maybe even a midlife problem. In my work, as I coach executives and spend a lot of time with leaders who are making these heavy decisions every day, with the intense amount of change that we're all faced with these days in the workplace, most of the burnout that I was seeing was showing up in people later in their careers, senior leaders in their 40s and 50s, maybe on the 40 side, they've taken on their first C-suite role, or they've been in it for a while and they're in their 50s, or they're getting ready to think about sort of what the December of their career looks like. So, it makes sense after carrying decades of pressure, um, that it's almost a rite of passage that someone would have a bit of burnout to show for all of the years of pushing and juggling that they've done in their life. So that made sense to me. I learned recently, as a result of spending some time with some young professionals and just doing some research on what I wanted to spend time noodling on with them, was some data that was incredibly compelling to me, that was done by a modern health study that was published by Forbes. And this data said, on a broad basis, that 66% of US workers were experiencing some form of burnout. And this study is pretty recent, it was done in 2025. That's two-thirds of the workforce. But then I looked at the age breakdown, given I was going to be talking to a younger part of that workforce, between ages 18 to 35. I expected to see that the burnout number would go down, and maybe this isn't really a relevant discussion, but I dug a little deeper. So, what I found was, I would say, disturbing. And when I began to share this information with them in my talk, I saw heads nodding and so much that was resonating with them, which, gave me the confirmation that I didn't really want to get. But let's get into the data. So, what it showed was that 81% of those between the ages of 18 and 24 were experiencing burnout. 81%. And they took the next slice of those between the ages of 25 and 34, and that group was experiencing 83% of burnout. As it was confirmed in the discussion that I facilitated with this group, it was supposed to be a keynote, but I really shifted it into a keynote slash workshop, because there was so much in the room that deserved some airtime. And it was fun to see them sort of feel like they were being seen by their peers and those of us who were in there supporting them. But what I heard from them were things like, we're finishing up college, whether it be undergrad or graduate school, in a time like now when the uncertainty is at the highest that we've ever seen, and they've seen a lot of uncertainty given they've lived through some pretty big changes. Most recently being the pandemic. The other changes that they talked about was, we thought we had a plan to finish school, get our careers on their feet, and then begin to think about family. And we're not in a position where we feel like that's a safe place right now to jump into when we're feeling unstable as humans trying to navigate this world today. So lots of really great discussions came out of that topic. But the youngest workers burning out at the highest rate was just mind blowing to me, especially as I was getting this confirmation from them in real time. I looked at, was this data different like 15, 16 years ago? And what I discovered was 17 years earlier, there had been a study done, or a number of studies done, that showed the average American hit their peak burnout around the age 42. So when you think about Gen Z and millennials today, they are at their peak burnout. They're arriving there at age 25, a full 17 years ahead of schedule if we're going to consider this study to be the standard. So before most people have even found their stride, and it's not slowing down, you know, it's scary to say the least. And in 2025, the AFLAC Workforce Report, which is I think it's the largest annual survey of US employees, found that burnout has now hit a 6-year high. 6-year high. This isn't a trend. This is a pattern that's been building while we kept telling young professionals to just work harder, wait their turn, take on a little bit more, don't be lazy, all of the stereotypes that we all have seen and heard being hurled at millennials, and just a different flavor of it at Gen Z. The real signal is people are breaking. And here's what the data doesn't fully capture, and that's that there's a huge human cost to this. This isn't just the impact on organizations. And, as we look at it through the lens of this data was done for US workforce, there's also a human factor that says, as a community, we are frayed around the edges, and that fray is coming in more and more. So I started hearing stories that didn't make the headlines. People who couldn't sleep, not occasionally, but chronically, lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, running through tomorrow's to do list. We've all been there. I think anyone at any age who's listening to this podcast will agree that we've been there at one point or another. But when I say this is happening chronically at such an early stage in people's careers, it's daunting to think of what they will look like mid career, and certainly when they're in their late 40s, 50s, and thinking about retirement. Should they follow that type of a path, it's scary to think of where people will be. That is what chronic stress does to a body. It doesn't announce itself, it just quietly erodes you. And people whose weekends stop feeling like weekends somewhere around 4 p.m. on a Sunday, that one I know personally because I've been there. I've eaten the cold dinner. I've sent the rain check text. Many, many times I've looked at a Sunday afternoon and felt nothing, not rest, not peace, just the weight of what's coming. And oftentimes I decide if I'm going to just be sitting here thinking about work, I might as well go ahead and do the work. I know a lot of people that do that. And then you are not, you are inorganically, but you pick up the laptop and you start your week on a Sunday afternoon. I didn't call it burnout when I was going through that, and my life is a bit different now, thank goodness. I called it dedication, which many of us do today. I call it the price of ambition, until I couldn't anymore. I had to understand what it was doing to me, personally, and what it wasn't really doing for the organization that I worked in and the team that I supported when they had an exhausted leader that wasn't 100% present throughout the week because I didn't allow myself to get the rest that I needed. So the hardest part isn't the long hours. It's that we genuinely can't tell if we're ambitious or just afraid to say no. What's driving it? Perhaps autopilot. So we're going to explore a little bit about that concept. Here's the thing. I want to name it. Burnout isn't just about workload. It's about what happens when capable, committed people stop making conscious choices and they start running on autopilot. I was talking with the young professionals recently, as I mentioned, a lot of high performing folks. Obviously, they're taking their Saturday, and it happened to be a gorgeous Saturday after several not so gorgeous weekends, to come into downtown Atlanta and spend time at Woodruff Art Center together to learn and to develop themselves as individuals. And I was privileged to be one of the several speakers that got to talk to them. And you know, clearly I can label them in generality here and say that they were high performing, high ambitious young people, the one everyone relies on, trust the one that I'm sure the ones that are trusted with a lot of things in their workplace, and doing a little bit of handshaking and meeting and greeting during the time that I was there. That was clearly those folks were who were represented in that room. So I'll share a story that I shared with them about a young lady who I know very well and have mentored throughout her career. And she told me a story about how she is feeling very burned out and she is in her, I'll call it late 30s at this point. She told me she was just burning out. She didn't want to acknowledge that she was burned out, but she could clearly feel that she was headed there, quickly. So I asked her to walk me through her week. And as I listened to her, it sounded like, on paper anyway, success. She had visibility, she had real responsibility at such a young age. She had opportunities within her organization to do different things. So there was certainly no chance of boredom. But as she's listing these things, I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. So I paused her and I said, let me ask you one question. What from these things that you're mentioning that you're spending your week doing did you choose? And what just sort of happened by default or on autopilot? She took a long pause and couldn't really answer. And that silence was everything to me because her yes had obviously stopped being a conscious decision. It had become a default. And that is autopilot. So here's the thing about autopilot, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like being a good employee, a good partner, a good everything. And I don't want to necessarily just make this about the workplace, but clearly that's one area, given the data that we shared, where we need to look at this from. It feels like being dependable, feels like success. And right up until the moment your body or your relationship or your Sunday afternoons tell you otherwise, it feels great. And you can justify the cost to you because of how it looks. And sometimes it's not even just about how it looks to you or feels to you, it's also how it looks and feels to others that are close to you. So here's what I want to offer. These people are not underperforming. That's clearly not the case here. Certainly not with the very specific example that I share. They are over adapting, or we are over adapting. And there's a big difference. So underperforming means you're not doing enough. That's a different type of stress. I wouldn't label it burnout. Over adapting means you're absorbing everything, every ask, every expectation, every unspoken need without ever stopping to choose. We call my best friend the leader, the VP of the helps ministry, because before she even thinks about it, she jumps in and solves the problem and addresses the issue and goes above and beyond for her colleagues, her team, and even those of us in her personal life. So many have become that, and that is the person who always delivers. So certainly not a knock on them, but never saying no and always being available does something to you from the inside. They're running on fumes and calling it fuel, and it will show up somewhere in the body, the mind, and overall in their life. How do we go about being aware, which is clearly the first thing and the most critical thing, because nothing changes if awareness is not first and foremost addressed. And I'm not going to give you a 10-step plan. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. And it's certainly something that I've been working through personally over the last year and a half since I've transitioned from full time in house executive roles into being an entrepreneur and calling the shots, but also carrying the full burden of success or failure. But it's giving me an opportunity to really look at these frameworks and tools so that I can first learn and adopt them myself and then share them with those that I support through my business and those I mentor and all of the anyone who is open to hearing. So here it is. I want to give you something that works at interrupting this default autopilot mode in the actual moment before the automatic yes. And that is one word: stop. 4 questions. So before the next automatic yes, I'm going to ask that you give space. And in that space, which is where the S and stop comes in, ask yourself a couple of powerful questions. Do I actually have the time, energy, and attention for this right now? So it's a quick capacity check. And capacity is not just about time, it's about energy, it's about attention. So that quick question of, do I have capacity for this right now? Okay. Not, can I force it? Do I genuinely have capacity? Okay. We're going to move on to T, which is true choice. And that is, am I choosing this, or is it just part of my default nature, whether it's accepting because someone has made the request or not even being given the choice? Oftentimes, when we join the helps ministry, we allow people to sort of break that boundary for us, or we break the boundary for ourselves, and people don't even give us choice anymore. They make the assumption that we are going to continue to take something on or take something on that's new, because we always have. We're the go-to and the default for the team or the organization or whatever community that you're referring to in that case. So, and there's a difference between a yes and an assumption. So if we have people in our lives who we have allowed to make those assumptions on our behalf, we are going to need to have some tough conversations. But T is for true choice, not default, and not assumptions that have been imposed by other people on us. All right. O is ownership. And that question is this actually mine to carry? Remember what I said earlier, burnout is about capable people who are forced to, whether it's by themselves or others or a combination of both, to carry something that is not theirs to carry, and they no longer carry it well. So then it becomes this vicious cycle of, I'm exhausted from carrying this thing, but I know I'm not doing well. And if you're the doing it well, and so if you are the type of person that is a perfectionist on top of that, that's a whole nother podcast. You are weaponizing your own self-critic on top of your exhaustion. So ask the question, is this actually mine to carry? Not everything that lands on your plate belongs there, and you need to do an inventory check from time to time. And then the last is P, and P is price. And the question there is, what does this yes actually cost me? And am I paying it consciously? So the conscious question continues throughout each of those steps, because again, we are trying to abolish this idea of being on autopilot until we burn out. So every question needs to be, is this mine to carry? And that needs to be a conscious question. What does this cost me? And am I paying it consciously? So we know, or we should know, and if not, we're learning that every yes costs us something. There's a currency of some sort. Most of us are paying it without checking the bill. And I know we do that a lot. I see all these commercials about, this app can help you find different things that you've subscribed to years ago you don't even use anymore, and you're automatically paying it, and you pay your credit card bill without seeing what's on that bill that month, et cetera. So you get the picture. So the other thing from a cost perspective is also to think about, when we say yes to something, we are saying no to something else by default, because we are forfeiting something that perhaps has a lot more value for us, just to take on something that is expected of us that we may not even find valuable for ourselves. But because we have not gone through this conscious check, we haven't stopped to go through this exercise, we continue to do the thing that is potentially soul sucking, and we don't allow ourselves to make space for something that could be healing, or could develop us in a more intentional way. So the word matters, because that's literally what I'm asking you to do is stop. Not forever, not dramatically, just long enough to choose. I started this episode asking when your weekend ended, because I think that question tells you everything. If your Sunday afternoon feels like yours, if rest actually feels like rest, you're probably okay. But if you're sitting on the couch doing nothing wrong and still feeling the weight of the week that hasn't even started yet, clock hasn't turned, it's not even midnight yet, never mind 8 a.m. on Monday morning, then that is not dedication. That's the signal. The data says burnout is hitting people 17 years earlier than we expected. I'm saying it might already be hitting you, and you don't have to wait for the collapse before you do something about it. You don't have to get sick to get the message. You don't have to lose every Sunday afternoon to understand what it's worth. Just stop. Before the next automatic yes, ask the 4 questions and choose. Thank you. Be sure to follow along for more unscripted leadership. Tune in on Spotify or YouTube, or all of the various social media outlets. You can find me at Instagram at Proverbs_leadership_coach. And my website is proverbsleadership.com. I'd love to hear more about your own experience with what we're covering. So feel free to share in comments, DM, whatever is easiest for you. See you soon. Thanks.